Hello guys, and welcome to a new video featuring a retro Linux distribution. Wait, let me try this again. Hello guys, and welcome to another video featuring a retro Linux distribution on this gorgeous 386 based PC. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, today we are going to be installing a very old version of Slackware on this 386 PC, version 1.1.2 to be exact, from the beginning of 1994, which will fit this PC very well. And we're going to be installing it using old school floppies. So this is going to be a lot of fun, let me tell you. So sit back and enjoy the ride. Imagine the year is 1993. You're rocking your beautiful 386 machine at 40 megahertz, and it's running this cozy little operating system called Microsoft Windows. Now, you can't be held accountable for the fact that this runs Windows, as it came pre-installed. And in fact, you have heard about this new kid on the block called Linux, and this is what we're going to be looking at in this video. How can we install an old distribution of Linux using floppies on this beautiful 386 based machine? So if you like the sights and sound of an old computer starting, its clunky power button, the VGA BIOS from Trident, the noisy memory count, the hard drive and floppy drives initializing, then you've come to the right place. Because let's face it, who doesn't like a good floppy based software install? Floppy disks going bad, a beautiful X Windows running on Linux, and sitting at the user prompt of a Linux-based system. Because just look at this setup. Isn't this a beauty? And before we continue, let's start by looking at the hardware on which we will be installing this old version of Linux. So let's take a quick look inside the PC. The top card that we have here is a standard I/O card for the hard drive, the disk drives, and serial parallel ports. The card beneath that is the video card that I'm going to be taking out now. So this is a Trident TVGA 8900C video card from around 1991-1992, and this one has excellent support in Linux. So the X Windows that you will be seeing shortly has excellent support for this video card, so we will be able to make use of more colors and higher resolutions. So this is an ideal fit for this era of computing. The next card that I want to show you is the networking card, because we want to hook this up to the internet, and this is a 3COM Etherlink 3 networking card. This is the 3C509B, and this is a card that has a coaxial connector and an RJ45 connector, so we can hook it up to our Ethernet network very easily, and that's also something we'll be doing in this video. And the final card we have here is the sound card, and this is a Soundblaster Pro, the CT1600. Now, the Linux version that we are going to be installing has sound support, and one of the sound cards that it does support is this Soundblaster Pro. So again, an ideal fit. I think in terms of hardware, this is spot on. We shouldn't have any difficulty getting all of this hardware up and running with this old version of Linux. And I almost forgot about this Mitsumi interface card, which is used to hook up the Mitsumi CD-ROM. So this CD-ROM drive, which is a single-speed drive, dates from an era where there was no standardization in terms of IDE CD-ROM drive, so you needed this interface card. And you can set stuff like IRQs and DMA channels on it, but I couldn't get it to play nicely with my networking card for some reason, so that will be something for part 2. And the CD-ROM drive is pretty special as well, with this special mechanism of loading drives. Now, the computer currently is running Microsoft Windows and MS-DOS, and unfortunately the hard drive is too small in order for it to have a dual boot setup with both Linux and MS-DOS. So I have decided to swap out this hard drive and install a new period correct hard drive that we will use to store our Linux on, and that is this Connor 210 megabyte hard drive from 1994. Uses a standard IDE connector, had some rework done probably inside the factory, because this was like common practice back in the day that you would use these little wires to make small corrections to issues with the PCB design. So I figured this will be a good host for our new Slackware installation. On the exterior we have the Mitsumi single-speed CD-ROM drive, a 5¼ inch floppy drive, a 3½ inch floppy drive, and to finish off the retro look we have the speed indicator, a clunky power button, a turbo button and reset button paired with a couple of LEDs. And for the input we have this beautiful keyboard with a really nice clicky sound to it. Now starting 1995-1996, Linux distributions on CD became very popular, thanks to Walnut Creek and InfoMagic bringing out these CD sets containing a variety of different Linux distributions. And not only were you able to find different distributions like Slackware or Red Hat, it also contained lots of additional software from different archives on the internet. Now remember that this was a time where broadband internet wasn't that common, so a lot of people still relied on dial-up, and having all of this on a CD-ROM format was very convenient. Now the version of Slackware that I'm going to be using here was never distributed on a CD-ROM. Instead, it was distributed on a set of floppy disks that you could download from an FTP site. Now the good folks over at Slackware still have this old version up on their slackware.com website, so we can download it from there. And it's not even the oldest version of Slackware that I'm going to be installing, as there is also a 1.0 version, but I wasn't able to find it online with the complete disk sets. So I opted for version 1.1.2, which was released in the beginning of 1994 with a 0.99.15 kernel. And remember, this is the era where an entire kernel source tree would fit on this 1.44 megabyte floppy. Now, if you were to do the same with a modern version, you would need this and this to store the more recent kernel source trees on floppy disks. So there's Linux evolution for you, measured by the amount of floppy disks. So back in the day, you actually needed somebody who had access to like a broadband connection to download all of this stuff, copy it over on floppies and distribute it like that. Now there is a README folder with some installation instructions, and the basic idea is that you create two disks, a boot disk and a root disk, to start the installation. Now the boot disk is needed to boot the system off of a floppy, and there are a number of different boot disks that you can use. Bare boot, for example, is for those who are running systems that only have IDE controllers and who want to do a floppy-based install. But if you had the software on CD-ROM, you would use the CD boot. Or if you wanted to do a networking install, you would need the net boot. And if you had SCSI hard drives instead of IDE, you would also need to have a different boot disk. So I've written the bare boot image onto a floppy disk. So let's go ahead and boot the PC with this floppy disk inserted. So what this disk is doing right now, it is loading up a kernel located on this floppy disk. It's uncompressing it right now and it's booting into Linux. And this is the bare boot image, so this only has support for IDE, so this will not pick up your CD-ROM drive or networking card. But it has detected the partition on the hard drive. But it is now prompting to insert a second disk. Some people refer to this as a root disk, but it's actually the disk that contains the setup program to kickstart the actual Linux setup program. Now there are two versions that you can use here. We have the Color 144 and the TTY 144. The first uses a colorful menu-based system, and the latter will use a more interactive text-based install. So let's insert the root disk into our PC. Hit enter, and it will load the disk into the RAM disk, which was created by the boot disk, and it will drop you into a Linux login prompt where you can log in as root and prepare the system for installation. And Slackware was, and to some degree still is, notorious for, not booting into a fancy setup program that does everything for you. You do need to do a lot of the groundwork yourself, like partitioning your hard drive, for example. Now, besides the boot disk and the root disk, we also need various disk sets that contain the actual base Linux system and a whole bunch of other stuff. Now mandatory is the A disk set, which contains the base Linux system. If you wanted to have the X Windows graphical user interface, you would also need the X disk set, which contains the X386 2.0 X Windows system. If you wanted to have networking, you needed to install the N disk set. And in contrast to the boot and the root disk, these disk sets could be copied over to MS-DOS formatted floppies, as they just contained a couple of archives that needed to be on there, and a simple MS-DOS formatted disk was sufficient for that. So here, if we scroll down to the X disk set, we have 5 of them. And as you can see, it just contains a bunch of tar files, basically. But now that we've booted from the 2 floppies, we are greeted with a Slackware login prompt. So we can log in as root. And the first thing we need to do before we can start the actual installation is to partition our hard drive. So I am going to be creating 2 partitions here, a Linux swap partition and a Linux root partition, or a Linux native partition, so that we can install our root file system in the Linux native partition. After messing around with the partitions, it's always safe to do a reboot. Now notice that the setup program here informs us that if we have 4 megabytes of RAM or less, which is the case, we must activate a swap partition before running the setup. So we have created the swap partition, but it also includes 2 instructions that we need to add in order to make the swap space and activate the swap space. And this is the make swap and the swap on command that we need to execute. This is something that you'll need to do, otherwise the installer will simply throw an out of memory error. And now we can finally start the setup program. So we just need to type setup, and we will enter this Slackware Linux setup program, which has a couple of entries here. And we will start by selecting our source media. So we have various options. We can choose floppy disks, NFS, pre-mounted folder, CD-ROM, but we're going to go for floppy disks. Select the first floppy disk drive, then select the target, which is our Linux native partition. We are going to format it. Then we can start selecting the disk sets. So we'll start with the base Linux system. We'll select the defaults here, giving us the option to prompt for optional packages. And it will then prompt us to insert disk A1. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's insert disk A1 into the disk drive, hit OK. And it will start installing the required packages from A1. So this includes some base directory structure with the /dev folder, the etc folder, and all of its files. We also have some other binaries which are needed. A kernel, very important. So we're going to be installing the IDE kernel, so no SCSI support. The Linux loader is also a required component. We're not going to be installing a kernel with SCSI support because we don't have any. System V style init programs loaded at startup. Let's insert disk A2. And I'm not going to bore you with all of the packages which are on disk A2 and A3. It's more of the same, so there are a couple of required packages, some are optional. And at the end, you will be given the option to create a boot disk. We're not going to do this now. We can configure a modem. We're not going to do that because we don't have one. We can configure our mouse. We will do that because we have a serial mouse. So let's go ahead and configure that. We have a CD-ROM, so it's a Mitsumi single-speed CD-ROM, so we're going to go ahead and select that one. We are going to be installing Lilo as well on the master boot record. Selection is a way to integrate the mouse in the Linux shell, and the time zone is something we'll also set up. And that's it. That pretty much completes the Slackware setup. So all we need to do now is exit this Slackware Linux setup program and reboot the machine. Now, in all honesty, this was the second time I did the setup because the first time I tried it, I got kicked out of the setup program with this error. So now let's start the PC with our freshly new Linux install. Again, I love this whole initializing process of the PC. So Lilo will be loading up Linux right now. It's booting the kernel. And let's take a look at what's happening here. So it has found our Mitsumi CD-ROM drive. It has found 2 serial ports. And that's the cool thing about Linux, is that you get to see all of this low-level information. So let's take a look here. It hasn't found any SCSI devices, which is normal. It has found our floppy drive. It has found our Ethernet card, our 3COM 3C509 card. It has found the 2 partitions. It's mounting the root file system. It's doing a file system check. This is something that will happen often if Linux hasn't been closed normally. So it's mounting the root device now, read write, and it should go into the login prompt right now. So we don't have any users yet, so we need to log in as the root user, which is what I'm doing here. And as you can see now, Linux is installed. We have kernel 0.99.15 installed. And now let's continue with the setup by executing the setup command, which will allow us to install X Windows. And that's what we're going to do now. So the first thing we need to do is we need to go into disk sets to decide which disk set that we want to install. Now there are different disk sets provided by Slackware. Each of them are identified by a letter or 2 letters. So in this case, we want to be installing the X Windows system, which is the base X368 2.0 X Windows system. So we're going to be selecting that, hitting OK. And then we're going to try and install the selected disk set, but we will be prompted to select a source media. This is the same thing as which we did in the beginning of the installation. And we can begin the installation now. We select default tag files again, so we can choose to install optional packages. And now we are prompted to insert disk X1. So there are a total of 5 disks needed for X Windows. So let's start with the first one and insert it in the floppy drive. Hit OK, and then it will load up the files from the floppy, which are basically compressed files, and then extract them to the hard drive. Now let's take a look at what's on these floppy disks. But before we do that, let's take a look at the X386 2.0 documentation released at the end of 1993. And let's scroll down to section number 5, where we get some more info on the supported video cards. Now, there are a couple of accelerated chipsets which are supported using dedicated accelerator servers, and this is the list here. And then in addition to that, we have a couple of other video cards which are supported by the more generic SVGA server. And this includes our Trident TVGA 8900. So on the first disk, we're probably going to see a lot of support for graphics chips that we don't have, so we can skip all of these packages like the Mach 32, Mach 8. We are going to be installing the documentation and release notes. And here we can actually hear the disk spinning and copying the files over to the hard drive, which is always a really nice sound to hear, something you don't get on a virtual machine. Now it's prompting for the second disk. So again, on the second disk, we will probably see a number of X servers to support different video cards. So we don't need monochrome support, we don't need S3 support, we can skip all of that, but we will be installing this Super VGA server, because the Super VGA server is an X server which does support our video card. So we're definitely going to be installing that one. As you can see, it will make it the default X server, so there will be a symbolic link put on this SVGA driver, which I'm going to show you in a minute. Here it's installing XDM, it's installing FVWM, which is the window manager, some libraries to support X Windows. And moving on to the third disk, let's see what we have on there. And on disk 3 we have the last of the X servers. This one supports 16 color graphic mode. We don't need that because we have the SVGA one, so I'm just going to skip this one. Some more libraries, bitmaps, fonts, stuff we need to get X Windows up and running, and some documentation. So we're also going to be installing that. Disk number 4. So let's see what's on this one. Again, some client libraries which are required. Some recommended fonts, we're going to be installing those as well. And then finally we can enter the 5th disk, which is also the last disk in the X disk set. So let's see what we have here. Again, some icons for the window manager this time. a set of sample configuration files, because it's always nice to have some kind of reference, as Xwindows at the time wasn't the easiest thing to configure. Xconfig to help you with the configuration, another font pack, and a screensaver for X. And that about wraps it up. Now obviously we're anxious to start X, but when we execute the command, we will see that it fails with the fatal server error, no config file found. So obviously we haven't provided a configuration for X just yet, but we did install some sample Xconfig files a while back, and the X command does accept an Xconfig parameter, which allows you to specify a config file on the command line. So let's check in this var x11 folder, and here you will see that there is a set of Xconfig files here. And there is a Xconfig file here specific for the Trident 8900C, which is the video card that we happen to have. So let's start X with this configuration file and see what it does. And it doesn't seem to be doing a whole lot. I mean, it's not giving an error, but it is giving this kind of garbled screen. So I remember the keyboard shortcut to change resolution, and after lowering the resolution to 640 by 480, which by accident happens to be the maximum resolution that this old monitor supports, I was able to get something on the screen. Now by copying this config file to the etc folder, we can use the start X command to automatically start Windows without providing a config file, because it will by default look at the etc xconfig file. And here we see a number of things. The configured X server is VGA256, which is the 8-bit color SVGA server, which does have support for our Trident video card. It has picked up our Xconfig in /etc/xconfig. It has found a mouse on /dev/mouse. It has found our fonts, and then it will detect the video RAM, the clocks, and there are 3 modes which are currently defined, 3 different resolutions that it thinks that this video card /monitor can handle. So it will start in the highest resolution, which is 1024 by 768. It will also set up a virtual resolution, and that's the reason why we didn't see anything, because this monitor doesn't support such a high resolution. But after lowering the resolution, we get a 640 by 480 screen. There is a virtual resolution also, so we can move the mouse around to get more screen real estate. And I actually had to speed up this footage quite a bit, because it took more than 20 seconds just to launch this single terminal in Xwindows. And the system feels very laggy and very slow to respond to not only UI input, but also like launching applications. I mean, 4 megabytes is definitely not enough to run Xwindows and make it workable. I mean, just setting up this desktop here took like 5 minutes to launch all of the applications and just position the windows like they are positioned here. It's really crazy. Yeah, so I don't know if the mic is picking this up, but the hard drive was swapping like crazy. And for those who don't like the flickering of the CRT monitor, here's a screen capture that I did. I really like this look and feel of these old Xwindows systems. I mean, the colors and the fonts are very raw, and yeah, really it's a throwback to the early 90s when these Linux X systems started to gain popularity. Now the next thing I want to look at is networking. So as I stated earlier, this system has a 3COM networking card, and it has detected the 3COM card here as the 3C509 card. It has detected the hardware address, the IRQs, the IO ports. And despite the fact that the kernel that we are currently running does have TCP support, we do need to install some additional networking components. And we're going to use the networking disk set for that. So the time has come to hook up that networking cable, and let's start the installation. So we're again going to be installing from floppy disks. There are 3 floppy disks in the networking disk set. So let's begin the installation. Again, we're going to use the default tag file, so we will be prompted for optional software. So let's start by inserting disk N1. And this one contains a lot of optional mail related applications, also some old dial-up stuff. We're all going to be skipping that. MailX we don't need. Netconfig is something that we do need because this will allow us to configure TCP/IP on our machine. We will install the TCP/IP networking programs and support files. Traceroute is also a nice utility to have. But then, yeah, Unix to Unix copy we don't need. On the second disk, again, a mail program, don't need. Pine, another mail program, we'll skip that. Smail, we don't need. Disk number 3. And there we have a lot of news-related programs. We also don't need that. I mean, NTP was a big thing back in the day, but with Google and Stack Overflow, we don't need that anymore. We're not going to be installing PPP, which is for like dial-up stuff. Tin, another newsreader, don't need that. Threaded newsreader, also don't need that. And that's it. Now, after installing a disk set, it will always prompt you to configure the system again. And typically this is all stuff that you've done already. But this time we can configure our network, and that's something we're going to do. So we can specify a host name, a domain name. We want to use more than just loopback, so we select no. We need to enter a static IP address, as this one doesn't support DHCP, a network address, gateway, netmask, broadcast, and finally a name server. So with that, the networking software has been configured, so let's try it out. Now if we do an ifconfig, we see our networking interface with the IP address that we just provided, and let's do a ping to the internet, and we get a reply. So this is all working excellent. So I really hope you've enjoyed this little throwback in time with Slackware version 1.1.2 on this old 386 based computer. Still a lot of stuff to uncover. For example, what would it be like to compile a kernel on this machine? How will we get the sound up and running?
Y'all ready for this?
Can we do an NFS install of Linux? Can we get the networking card and the CD-ROM to play nicely? I think I'll be doing a part 2 where I will be going into these topics a little bit more in depth. But for now, I really hope you've enjoyed this one. Please check out some of the other videos on the channel. Consider subscribing to the channel, and I hope to see you guys very, very soon. Bye-bye.